Police officer shoots black kid's German shepherd, unaware his father is an FBI agent. In a dimly lit office, Ethan Matthews stands rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, staring down Officer Ryan Hayes, a man whose calm demeanor only fuels Ethan's boiling rage. The silence is thick, suffocating, as Ethan's voice cuts through the tension like a blade. You killed my dog, Hayes. You took my Max from me for no reason. And now you've got my son, Jamie, locked up in that hellhole. Why? His words are low, heavy with an intensity that shakes the room. Ethan's chest heaves with each breath, the years of grief, anger, and helplessness pouring out in this single moment. His face is a mask of pain, his eyes filled with the fury of a father who has been wronged, and an individual who has seen too much of his world shattered by injustice. Officer Hayes doesn't flinch. He leans back in his chair, calm as ever, but his eyes flicker with something darker, something calculating. Your dog attacked me first, Matthews. I was just defending myself, he replies coolly, his words dripping with a level of detachment that seems almost mechanical. Ethan's fists are shaking now, not from fear, but from an uncontrollable torrent of rage that surges through him like wildfire. His eyes, bloodshot and filled with desperation, never leave Officer Hayes' face. He steps forward, the harsh scrape of his boots against the floor echoing in the cold, silent office, but Hayes doesn't flinch. There's a certain arrogance in the officer's calmness, a shield that Ethan is determined to break. You think you can just dismiss this, Hayes? Ethan's voice cracks, but there's a venomous intensity beneath it that threatens to tear the room apart. His breath comes in sharp, uneven gasps, the weight of his words hanging between them. You took my dog, my best friend. I had him for years. And now you've got my son in your filthy custody, you bastard. What the hell have you done to him? Hayes leans forward, eyes narrowing as he locks his gaze onto Ethan's. A smirk creeps onto his face, the faintest twitch of amusement flickering in his cold blue eyes. Your son is nothing but a criminal, Matthews. Just like you. His voice is measured, almost mocking, but there's something beneath it that sets Ethan's blood boiling. I didn't do anything to him he didn't deserve. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. His hands ball into fists, nails biting into his palms, but he refuses to show weakness. You don't know a damn thing about my son, Hayes. You think just because you wear that badge, you can destroy people's lives and get away with it? My son is a kid. A good kid. He doesn't deserve this. Ethan's voice drops to a growl, the fury in his tone now undeniable, like the storm building inside him is ready to erupt. Hayes remains unmoved, his posture still relaxed, almost as if he's the one in control of the situation. You don't understand, Matthews, he says, his voice calm but laden with a dark, unsettling confidence. I was doing my job. And your son, your precious Jamie, well, he got in the way. Ethan's world narrows to a single point, the steady, taunting cadence of Hayes' voice. His muscles coil with the tension of someone at the edge of breaking, and just as quickly, his fury flares. He's across the room in an instant, his hand slamming down on the desk with enough force to rattle the papers. You listen to me, Hayes, he snarls, his voice now barely a whisper, each word dripping with venom. I will burn this whole damn place down if I have to. You've made the biggest mistake of your life. Hayes leans back in his chair, the eerie calmness of his expression making Ethan's blood boil even more. And what are you going to do about it, Matthews? He speaks with such detachment that Ethan is left momentarily speechless, his chest heaving with the struggle to control the wild storm of emotions surging within him. The silence between them is suffocating, the tension in the air so thick that it feels as though it could snap at any moment. Ethan stands there, staring down Hayes, the burning need for justice pulsing through him. Every inch of his body aches with the desire for retribution, but deep down, he knows he's standing on the edge of something much darker. He's not just fighting for his son or his dog anymore. He's fighting for his own sanity, for his very soul. I'm going to tear you apart, Ethan growls, his voice now a low, dangerous rumble that reverberates through the room. Piece by piece. And I'm going to make sure you pay for everything you've done. Hayes' smirk fades slightly, replaced by a flicker of doubt, something Ethan hasn't seen before. But before he can react, the door to the office bursts open with a sharp crash, and two more officers step inside, their presence an unwelcome reminder of the power Hayes holds over the situation. I think it's time you calm down, Matthews, one of the officers says, his voice low, but firm. The other officer's hand hovers near his gun, a silent threat hanging in the air. Ethan's gaze never leaves Hayes'. He can't afford to show weakness, not now, not with everything on the line. You can lock me up if you want, he says, his voice eerily calm now, the rage still simmering beneath the surface. But know this isn't over. Not by a long shot. Hayes doesn't respond, but the faintest trace of uncertainty crosses his face. The walls between them are now more than just a matter of power. They're a matter of wills. And for the first time, Ethan feels like he might actually break through. Got it. Let me expand the second key point and make it more intense. The city felt colder than ever that night. Ethan's boots echoed on the empty streets, the rhythmic thump of each step in sharp contrast to the chaotic thoughts swirling in his mind. His hands were balled into fists, knuckles white from the pressure, his body tense as if waiting for something to break. Every part of him was on edge, from the pit in his stomach to the burning tightness in his chest. There was no going back. Not anymore. After what happened in Hayes' office, after the confrontation that had nearly shattered him, he was lost, and he knew it. The world around him blurred as he walked through the streets, the buildings towering above him like silent witnesses to the madness unfolding inside him. The city, once so familiar, now felt alien, its streets no longer a place of comfort, but a maze he could no longer navigate. The hum of distant traffic, the flickering streetlights, the occasional shout from a passerby, it all seemed like background noise to the war inside his own head. His thoughts were dark, sharp, and growing more and more dangerous with each passing second. Ethan's mind kept returning to one image, his son, Jamie. His face, pale and terrified, haunted him at every turn. Had he done enough to protect him? Had he been blind to what was happening to the boy? The questions gnawed at him, but there were no answers. Jamie had been arrested, taken away by the very system Ethan had spent his entire life trying to avoid. And now, in the aftermath of his encounter with Hayes, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a part of him cracking open. Was it fear? Was it guilt? Or was it something darker, something that had been waiting for this moment to surface? Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The anger, the frustration, it was all bubbling to the surface, threatening to overflow. He had been through too much. Too many sleepless nights, too many broken promises, too many shattered hopes. All of it had led to this one moment, this one point where he stood at the edge of a precipice, ready to fall. But even as the rage clawed at him, something deeper took root, something more insidious. A voice inside him whispered that he didn't have to play by the rules anymore. The rules had never worked in his favor. They had failed him, failed his family. They had allowed Jamie to be taken, allowed the system to continue its stranglehold on their lives. He had fought against it his whole life, tried to outsmart it, outmaneuver it. But now he realized there was another way, a more direct way, a way that didn't involve waiting for someone else to act, to make the changes. He could burn it all down. His thoughts spiraled further as he moved deeper into the city, each step a pounding reminder of how far he was from the man he once was. There was no turning back from this. No going back to the days when things had been simpler, when Jamie had been just a kid, playing soccer in the park, laughing at the stupid jokes Ethan made. That man was gone, replaced by someone else. A man willing to do anything to get his son back, even if it meant destroying everything in his path. The night was growing darker, and with it his resolve hardened. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't afraid of Hayes, of the police, of the system that had failed him. He wasn't even afraid of what it would cost him to see this through. All he had was the raw, seething need to make them all pay. And it was growing stronger with every step he took. As Ethan passed an alley, he froze. There, standing just ahead, was a figure, tall, with broad shoulders, wearing a long dark coat that blended with the shadows. The man's face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but Ethan could feel the weight of his gaze even from the distance. The air between them was thick with tension, a silence that felt like the calm before a storm. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the figure spoke, his voice low and chilling, almost a whisper. "You're making a mistake, Matthews." Ethan's blood ran cold, but his anger flared. The man knew his name, knew who he was. He had no idea who this person was, but in that moment, none of it mattered. Ethan's hand went instinctively to the gun at his side, fingers brushing the cold metal of the handle, but he didn't pull it out. "Not yet. Who the hell are you?" Ethan growled, stepping forward. His voice was rough, but there was a sharp edge to it, like he was ready to strike at any moment. The figure didn't flinch, didn't move an inch. Instead, the man tilted his head slightly, as though he were sizing Ethan up, trying to read him. "You think you're just going to burn it all down, destroy everything in your path to get your son back?" he asked, his voice calm, too calm. But that's not how this works. You'll just become part of the system you hate so much. Another cog in the machine, a casualty of your own rage. Ethan's chest tightened. The man's words hit him like a punch, but there was something in the tone, something in the way the man spoke, that made Ethan hesitate. For just a split second, doubt crept into his mind. Was he really just another pawn in a game he didn't even understand? Was he really any different from the very people he despised? The man continued, his voice colder than the night air around them. You think you can fight fire with fire. But fire consumes everything, Matthews. And once it's out of control, once it's burned through all the things you care about, it won't matter who started it. It will consume you too. Ethan's anger flared again, hotter, more intense. I'm not afraid of burning, he said through gritted teeth. I'm not afraid of losing everything. What do you think I've been living for all this time? If I have to destroy this whole damn city to get my son back, I will. The figure seemed to contemplate this for a moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with the weight of his words. Finally, he spoke again, but this time there was something almost pitying in his tone. You're already lost, the man said, his words a soft echo in the night. You just don't know it yet. Before Ethan could respond, the man turned and melted back into the shadows, his figure disappearing as if he had never been there at all. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, the man's final words hanging in the air like a curse. He felt the weight of them pressing down on him, the heaviness of the warning. Had he really crossed a line? Was it too late to turn back? But before Ethan could make sense of his thoughts, the anger surged again. The man was wrong. He wasn't lost. He wasn't going to be another casualty of the system. No, he was going to take control. He was going to make them all pay. And no one, not this man, not Hayes, not anyone, was going to stop him. Absolutely. Here's the third key point, focusing on the lack of remorse from the agent. Ethan's phone vibrated in his pocket, the buzzing against his leg a harsh interruption to his train of thought. He pulled it out, his eyes narrowing as he read the incoming message. It was from Agent Keller, an agent who had become a shadow in his life, someone who had crossed lines and blurred moral boundaries in ways that should have shattered his conscience. Instead, there was nothing, no sign of guilt, no remorse for the destruction Keller had caused. Just cold, calculated orders. The message was simple: meet me at the old warehouse. We need to discuss the next steps. Ethan's jaw clenched as he read the words. He had already known this meeting was coming. Keller was part of the system, part of the very machine Ethan had been trying to dismantle for years. But it was worse than he had imagined. Keller wasn't just part of it. He was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with it. And now, he was giving Ethan the final chance to make a deal. But there would be no negotiation. Keller didn't need to bargain. He never did. He never showed remorse for anything, let alone for what he had done to Ethan's life. As Ethan walked through the abandoned streets toward the warehouse, every step felt heavier, like he was carrying the weight of his own vengeance on his back. The streetlights flickered above him, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, mirroring his own dark thoughts. But none of it mattered. The world around him had faded, and all that was left was Keller. And Ethan's rage. He reached the warehouse, its massive steel doors looming like the mouth of some monstrous beast waiting to devour him. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't sure what would happen tonight, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to beg. Not for mercy. Not for justice. There would be no pleading here. Just an end to everything. As he stepped inside, the dim light revealed Keller standing at the far end of the room, his silhouette a dark figure in the shadows. His posture was stiff, his hands behind his back, his stance as impassive as ever. The usual smug smile that had marked Keller's face during their previous encounters was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was an eerie calm, a disquieting sense of control that made Ethan's skin crawl. "You're late," Keller said, his voice smooth, almost patronizing. Ethan's eyes burned with the weight of his anger. "I'm here. What's this about?" Keller didn't immediately answer. He took a step forward, his boots echoing in the cavernous space, each step calculated, deliberate. There was something almost predator-like in the way he moved, as though Ethan was just another pawn in his chess game. "You're angry," Keller observed, his tone so detached, so neutral, it felt like a physical slap. "You're angry because your son was taken from you, because you're watching your world crumble to dust. But let me ask you this, Ethan. What have you really lost?" Ethan's hands tightened into fists at his sides. Keller's question wasn't rhetorical. It was probing, invasive. It was as though Keller was trying to strip away the layers of Ethan's anger and uncover something deeper. But Ethan wouldn't let him. He wasn't about to let Keller make him question himself. "I've lost everything," Ethan spat. "And you're the reason for it." Keller didn't flinch. In fact, he almost seemed amused. "Oh, I'm sorry. You think I've wronged you, Ethan? That I've caused your misery? But you don't understand." He took another step forward, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling clarity. "I did what I had to do. I followed the rules. I'm just doing my job. And if you think that you're the first person to lose someone you love because of my actions, you're deluded." The words struck Ethan like a physical blow. Keller wasn't even pretending to care. No apology, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, not even the faintest hint of guilt. Keller was a man who had built a career out of wrecking lives without a second thought. He didn't see Ethan's pain. He saw only a problem to be solved. "You think your job justifies everything, don't you?" Ethan's voice trembled with fury, his whole body vibrating with the intensity of his emotions. "You think following orders is enough to excuse the fact that you've ruined lives. But you don't care, do you? You never cared about the families you destroyed, the people you ruined. To you, we're just pieces on a board. It doesn't matter how many lives you crushed to get ahead." Keller's eyes narrowed. There was no hint of remorse, no flicker of shame in his gaze. Just cold, calculated indifference. "No, Ethan," he replied, his voice still unnervingly calm. "I care about results. I care about getting the job done. And if that means sacrificing a few lives along the way, so be it. Because, in the end, it's all about the bigger picture. Your son, your pain, it doesn't matter. You're just a small piece in a much larger game." Ethan felt his blood boil. The words, so detached, so lacking in any human empathy, stung worse than any physical injury. Keller was right. In his eyes, Ethan was nothing more than an obstacle, just another pawn to be moved in whatever twisted strategy he was playing. "You've already made your decision," Keller continued, his voice colder now. "You'll either fall in line, or you'll become a casualty of the system. It's as simple as that." Ethan's mind reeled. He had already known Keller was heartless, but hearing it spoken so plainly, so matter-of-factly, made the reality hit him like a thunderclap. Keller wasn't some misguided agent. He wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was a man who had consciously chosen to live without remorse, without care for the destruction he left in his wake. And that was what made him dangerous. Without another word, Keller turned his back to Ethan, signaling the end of the conversation. There was no need for further discussion, no need for explanation. Ethan knew that now. Keller wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to feel sorry for the damage he had caused, and he would never stop in his pursuit of control and power. As Ethan stood there, fists clenched at his sides, the weight of Keller's indifference pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had been right about one thing. The system didn't care. It didn't care about Ethan. It didn't care about Jamie. It didn't care about anyone but itself. And in that moment, a cold realization washed over him. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to save his son, he would have to fight like Keller. He would have to cast aside any illusion of morality and become just as ruthless, just as unforgiving. Because if he didn't, he would be swallowed whole by the same system that had already taken everything from him. Here is the fourth point on the theme of police brutality and racial profiling, followed by the conclusion. The streets had never been more alive, yet Ethan could feel the air suffocating him. He had been here before. No, not just in this place, but in this moment. The weight of history pressed down on him, pressing into his chest as he walked through the crowd. The protests had erupted across the city, fueled by a collective anger, a frustration that had been building for years. The brutality that had been perpetuated, the targeting of innocent lives, the clear disregard for human rights. All of it had finally reached a boiling point. And Ethan, a man who had once believed in the possibility of change, was standing in the middle of it all, wondering if the world would ever see justice. But it wasn't just the protests that had brought him here. It was a memory, a night that felt like it had happened in another life. That night, Jamie had been arrested, and it wasn't for anything he had done. It wasn't for the crimes they had accused him of. It wasn't for the petty theft they claimed, the bogus charges that had been slapped on him to silence his voice. No, it was because of his skin. It was because he had been a young black man walking down a street late at night, and the officers had seen nothing but a target. Ethan had been there, just a few feet away when it happened. He had watched the officers slam Jamie against the squad car, their hands rough, their eyes full of something darker than just duty. The words they had shouted at him were laced with a venomous racial contempt, the force of their actions reflecting a systemic hatred that was deeply embedded within the institution. It was the same brutality that had been witnessed over and over again, from city to city, from one generation to the next. The same story: a young black man, harassed by the system, subjected to a violence that was as old as the country itself. But this time, it was personal. This time, Ethan's son had been caught in the crossfire of an unforgiving system, one that had always seen black bodies as expendable. Ethan had screamed. He had begged the officers to stop, to show some decency, but they had ignored him. They didn't care about him. They didn't care about Jamie. They didn't care about the years of anger that had been building inside the community. All that mattered to them was maintaining control, upholding a broken system that had long since ceased to serve the people it was supposed to protect. Jamie had been taken away that night, and the anger that had built in Ethan's heart had never gone away. He had watched his son disappear into the back of that police car, watched as the officers walked away with smug expressions on their faces, as though they had done nothing wrong. And that was the hardest part. There was no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. No sense of guilt for the way they had treated Jamie. No remorse for the lives they had damaged. The protesters now flooding the streets were calling for justice, for accountability, for the recognition of the pain that had been inflicted for far too long. They were marching for the lives that had been lost, for the families torn apart, for the systemic oppression that had plagued their communities. They were calling for the end of racial profiling, for an end to the brutality that had been sanctioned by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. But as Ethan stood there, watching the masses chanting, the tension in the air palpable, he couldn't help but wonder if it would ever stop. Would there ever be real change? Would the officers who had treated his son like an animal ever face consequences for their actions? Or would the cycle continue, just as it always had, with one more generation growing up in fear, one more soul lost to a system that was designed to break them? The protests were more than just a fight against one officer's actions. It was the culmination of years of pain, years of neglect, years of discrimination that had been ignored. Ethan could feel the weight of it, the decades of suffering, in every step he took, in every shout of the crowd. It was a fight for the future, for a world where his son could walk the streets without fear of being targeted, without fear of being seen as less than human. As the chants grew louder, more unified, Ethan couldn't help but think of the one thing that had always kept him fighting, the hope that one day the world might change. But as he turned his gaze back to the officers in the distance, their presence looming like a storm cloud, he wondered if this would be enough. Was the fight really about a single case? Or was it about a system that had failed time and time again? Ethan knew that the road ahead would be a long one. The anger, the loss, the deep sense of betrayal, those things didn't fade easily. And as much as he wished he could go back to a time when his world hadn't been shattered, he knew there was no turning back. He had already crossed a line, had already descended into a world where justice didn't come easily, where morality and legality didn't always align. The corruption that ran through the veins of the system couldn't be eradicated overnight. It couldn't be fixed by simply exposing a few bad officers or making a handful of arrests. No, it was deeper than that. It was embedded in the very fabric of society, in the way people were treated based on the color of their skin, in the way power was maintained through fear and oppression. But Ethan also knew that change was possible. He had seen it before in the eyes of the protesters, in the unity of the people who had come together to demand accountability. There was power in numbers. There was power in their voices. And as much as the system had tried to break him, as much as Keller had tried to manipulate him into submission, Ethan knew he couldn't give up. Not now. For Jamie. For all those who had come before him. And for the future. Ethan would keep fighting, even if it meant becoming a force of reckoning in the very system that had taken everything from him. The battle wasn't just for justice anymore. It was for a world where no one had to live in fear of becoming another statistic. It was a fight that had no end, but it was a fight worth every sacrifice. And as Ethan walked away from the protest, his heart still heavy with the weight of it all, he made a silent promise. He would keep fighting, not just for his son, but for everyone who had been lost along the way. This fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot.